You know the rules. You can just scan the QR code and submit some questions on Slido. I think some of you have done this already, especially relating to the first talk. But there's so far a bit of a lack of questions relating to the second talk. So please go ahead and submit your questions. In the meantime, I think let's just get started. I think, James?
Yeah, maybe I'll kick it off. Cliff, as someone who kind of independently discovered public key cryptography, but had to keep it classified for years, how do you kind of personally reflect on seeing others receive public recognition for the same discoveries?
OK. Well, first of all, we didn't do the work with any expectation whatsoever that it would ever be in the public domain. So there was no expectation whatsoever that we were going to get any recognition. So my first reaction when I saw it was utter surprise, and I was.
Where did you see it?
At the time I was away from GCHQ, out of the system altogether, working for the MOD, and at one lunchtime I'd picked up Scientific American and read Martin Garler's article at RSA and thought, oh, seen that before. So that was a great surprise. But I think it's fair to say I haven't had recognition. I mean, since we made it public, I had quite a lot, I think.
Mm-hmm. And can you maybe expand a little bit more? Because you said that this was a problem that GCHQ was having difficulty with. Mm-hmm. That's why they tasked James Ellis to have a look at it.
Yeah.
And you effectively solved the problem and handed them the solution. Well, yeah. And yet there wasn't a lot of kind of practical uptake. And you mentioned something about there being some practical challenges at the time to actually implementing it.
Very much. Yeah, very much there were. So, yeah, I mean, both mine and Malcolm's, which was essentially Diffie-Hellman, and he was thinking of using fields of order 2 rather than, or fields of characteristic 2, and multiplicative group of that, which would have been the simpler one to implement. It was still going to be a very large piece of kit. And remember, the idea of doing this was to reduce the cost of key management. And so the feeling at the time, and I think correctly, was that technology wasn't yet up to making it cost-effective. And indeed, the first application, which was to secure telephone system, was done, well, NSA, the STU-3 phone in the early 80s, and there was a commercial product at about the same time. So it was probably 10 years, close to 10 years, before it really became feasible at all to implement this in a way that was actually worth doing if you cared about the cost, which was why we were doing it in the first place.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So a question for James, actually. I mean, you mentioned both the Polymath project, and you also mentioned the work of Andrew Wiles, which was probably very much at the other end of the scale, because I think he famously pretty much sort of retreated to his attic for something like a decade or two until he re-emerged with a proof in hand. So how does mathematical research actually progress these days, typically? Is it much more on, around these mega collaborations, or is it still very much sort of individually based, or is it a mixture of the two?
Certainly in my experience, it's a bit of a mixture. It's day-to-day mathematical research. For me, I like to work on my own, but often I'm collaborating with one other person. So often we'll meet up and chat over Zoom or something once a week, and then we'll go off and think about things on our own. But normally my collaborations just involve one or two other people. So the Polymath project, for maybe those who don't know, was this very large-scale online collaborative project that was organized after some of these results about bounded gaps between primes came out to try and improve the numerical constant and get down to this number 246. And this was a very different way of working for me. I'm not sure it's fully caught on, but for certain problems, I think it's a sort of very exciting and different way of doing mathematics that can include lots and lots of different people, and you can make progress much, much faster when you outsource it. But it only works, I feel, on very specific types of problems.
Okay. So within G Research, I guess the work we do is a lot less, I guess, pure like the maths you do is. and we're trying to kind of solve financial markets, and it's a messy problem. And one thing that we found very successful is kind of throwing machine learning and lots of compute at problems. Recently, DeepMind managed to show remarkable progress on matrix multiplication, another problem that progress had stalled, and then they used reinforcement learning techniques to kind of find a more efficient approach to multiplying matrices. Do you think similar approaches might be able to be applied to factoring, say, large numbers into their primes?
So as far as I understand it, the OpenAI work on improved sped up matrix multiplication, they essentially fed in a few different mathematical techniques and tricks that were very common to lots of the different algorithms that pre-existed, and then they asked for the AI to come up with lots of different ways of meshing these together and trying to combine them in a more efficient way. And lots of the previous mathematical kind of world records were some combination of these, and the AI essentially came up with a more sophisticated version of this. So my feeling is that when there's problems of this sort of nature, that you have a fairly small bag of tricks that can work in lots of different ways, and there's different ways of combining them, and people are coming up with more and more and more complicated variations by hand of trying to combine them to get smaller and smaller progress. This is something that it's ripe for compute to blow humans out of the water with, and to even if you can't necessarily brute force all combinations, it's something that AI has real opportunity. If it's something where you're kind of more theoretically limited, then I feel that there's AI's at the current stage at least is not going to come up with a sort of big theoretical advance. So in terms of the factoring algorithms, maybe Cliff is more expert on this than me, but there's various sub-problems, and it's quite plausible that AI or large amounts of compute could be better than some current humans or current humans at squeezing the optimum out of pre-existing methods, where the fundamental theoretical framework's there, but maybe there's more scope for clever twists and tricks and optimizations. But my feeling is that the current state of AI, at least, isn't good for coming up with a kind of big breakthrough, theoretical breakthrough. And so it's this sort of situation when you're trying to squeeze more out of what you have already that AI and compute can really help with you.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. AI would be really good at or potentially could be good at tweaking the parameters to with the existing method to slightly improve the parameters. But what's really needed if you want to do better with factorization is a new idea. And it's not clear that AI is it's better at interpolation than extrapolation, I guess.
So if we put kind of modern ML to the side, what do you think about kind of interactive theorem provers then, like Lean or Coq? Are those tools useful to you in your current research, or can you imagine them being useful in the future?
So this is very much an open debate amongst mathematicians at coffee time and things, and mathematicians have a pretty wide spectrum of beliefs. I think it's fair to say that right now, sort of theorem provers and Lean don't affect the working life of a mathematician too much, but it's very interesting to see how far it will go. At the moment, the interface with Lean, I think, is still a bit new and a bit difficult for mathematicians, really, and it requires a lot of work to turn a proof that you have into a Lean formally verified proof. But you need to already have the proof and everything pre-existing. I think there's some areas of mathematics where there are some results that mathematicians really, really care about the statement being true or not, and don't care too much about the proof. And for those things, it could be really useful to have a formalized proof. So a famous example is the classification of finite simple groups. This was a monumental effort in 20th century mathematics, classifying all finite simple groups. And the full proof runs to thousands of pages, and essentially no one mathematician understands the full proof or can necessarily reproduce all of it. So mathematicians use this as a theorem as a black box without needing to know any of the genuine truth, but no individual mathematician knows the entire proof. And because it's so many thousands of pages, it's not beyond the realm of possibility that there's a slight issue somewhere. It's not that I believe that the claimed result is false, but I'm not 100% confident that the proof is correct because I've never really studied the full 1,000-page proof. And so that's an example of something where I think it would be kind of valuable to me as a theoretical mathematician to have a formal verification that this is indeed a correct theorem, and I don't need to, and I'm not really relying on something where the foundations are somewhat dodgy. But that's not the typical example where normally we care about the ideas of the proof more than the formal correctness or falseness.
Do you find it harder to attract talent into those areas because you now have to compete with areas like finance?
So clearly there is a level of competition and there's also a level of collaboration. If I could flick my fingers and the finance industry would no longer hire mathematicians and would have nothing to do with mathematics, would this be better for pure mathematicians like me? Well, there'd be some advantages, but there'd also be some disadvantages. Places like G Research and others certainly help promote mathematics and help promote departments. It's an alternative career prospect for people going into mathematics. I think it's very good to have both options available to people.
Clearly, you can't possibly compete with the salaries. I mean, there's no question there. We're looking for a sort of a mix of talent from people who are really very sort of high-powered in terms of technical mathematics to those people that we think are potentially going to go on and become really great managers. So we're looking for a fairly broad spectrum, and the numbers are not that huge. So I don't believe it's really affected recruitment.
I guess maybe I'll switch gears. I'd be remiss without asking a question about quantum computing. You touched on it at the end of your talk, Cliff, and you mentioned that some of the kind of legacy protocols might be vulnerable once we have kind of large-scale quantum computers. And you also mentioned that NIST has now come out with this set of standardized post-quantum
the first set
algorithms. Is that just like problem solved now?
No.
We just switch those on, or are there other challenges?
I mean, first of all, it looks like we're quite some way off a quantum computer having the capacity to attack practical sizes. So there is no panic, no urgency, I think, other than for any data that you might actually feel needs to be protected for a very long time, in which case you probably want to take some other measures as well. The big problem is that the newer methods are in no way backwards compatible. They tend to use much larger key sizes, so you don't get quite the same functionality as you get with RSA and Diffie-Hellman. So the migration will not be easy. It's also the case, of course, that the problems have not yet had as much scrutiny as the existing systems, although they've had a fair bit. And also, what NIST is doing is, I believe, an ongoing program, so there will be more solutions but based on on other methods in the pipeline. So it's not clear that you really want to migrate with any urgency at the present time.
Actually, a related question there is, and it received quite a few upvotes as well, is that the question relates to the fact that in the past, I think it is now known that the NSA in the past did sabotage some crypto standards, and the question here is about why the newly published crypto standards are ever more complex, and I guess that very much does apply to the quantum resistant or quantum hard encryption standards as well. So I guess. To rephrase the question, how can we be sure that the quantum hard crypto standards as published don't somehow have a back door that has been injected
Okay, well, you have to look at the process that NIST adopted to develop these. And it was a very open process. It was very public domain. I mean, everything was basically open about the whole process. The call for proposals, the proposals were looked at. There was an open call for analysis. I mean, that's basically where the trust comes from.
Yeah.
A question for James. Perhaps kind of the most famous open problem in mathematics, certainly the most famous problem concerning prime numbers must be the Riemann hypothesis. Quite recently, there were some sensational headlines that Christoph mentioned, indicating that you'd made kind of the first breakthrough in 80 years with your collaborator, Larry Guth. Could you maybe talk a little bit briefly about what the Riemann hypothesis is, what you managed to achieve, and most importantly, though, if you were a betting man, would you bet on the hypothesis being solved in the next century?
Okay, yeah, there's a few questions there. So, in my talk today, I talked mainly about the small-scale structure of the distribution of prime numbers, about things to do with the gaps. And normally, if you're interested in a sequence, you can look at the small-scale structure, or you can look at the large-scale structure. And it turns out that the large-scale structure is questions like counting the number of primes up to x very accurately. And the behavior of this is completely governed by a very mysterious function known as the Riemann zeta function. And in particular, this is a complex function, and so it has complex zeros. And the Riemann hypothesis is this claim made by Riemann that all the zeros, or at least the non-trivial zeros of the Riemann zeta function they're all complex numbers with a real part and an imaginary part, and the real part should always be equal to 1/2. And you can go out and get a computer, and they have, you can calculate what some of these zeros are, and the first one is 1/2 plus, I think, 14.1 something, something, something I, and then you can calculate and you can verify that the first 10 to the 10 zeros all lie on this line, and they all have real part exactly equal to 1/2. And the claim is that absolutely every zero should have this property. If this were true, this would have very profound implications for the distribution of primes, because these zeros really govern the behavior of the primes. And you might have heard the phrase, the music of the primes. This often refers to these zeros and the effect of these zeros on the distribution of primes. They have wave-like effects. So my work with Larry wasn't proving the Riemann hypothesis, unfortunately, but it was showing that there are few zeros that are far away from the half-line. So the Riemann hypothesis is true in some sort of approximate statistical sense. Again, it was coming up with a weak version of the problem, and there's a precise technical quantification for what few zeros means, and mathematicians had been stuck about ruling out the possibility that there were lots of zeros on the three-quarter line for a very long period of time. There'd been essentially no progress on that problem for 80 years, and we were able to rule out there being lots and lots of zeros on the three-quarter line that had various implications for the distribution of primes. Unfortunately, this isn't necessarily the right direction to go if all you care about is proving the Riemann hypothesis itself, because our method was very much tailored to these zeros that are off the line, and kind of there's a natural limitation in our method that wouldn't, that couldn't possibly show that there are no zeros on the three-quarter line. And so it's going to need another idea to prove the Riemann hypothesis, but no one has any idea of what these ideas are. Which leads me to the final bit of the question, that nobody has any idea about how to prove the Riemann hypothesis at the moment. That's at least my take on it, that there's been a few wild speculations, but there's no even guessed path as to how you might try and prove the Riemann hypothesis. And so it's basically a fool's game to try and predict when the Riemann hypothesis will eventually be solved. But I remember, but nevertheless, I was asked to play this game, so play it I will. And I remember Andrew Wiles having a similar question asked to him, and he said, well, if you imagine that you're sort of uniformly distributed in time, then typically, if there's been an open problem, on average you'll be, distributed sort of in the middle of the time that the problem's been open for. So if you have no better guess, then you should guess that it will remain open for the length of time that it has currently been open. I'm not sure I completely buy the logic of this, but in the absence of a better answer, I'll say so the Riemann hypothesis has been open for more than 100 years, and so by default, I guess that it will be open for more than 100 years still, although I really, really hope I'm wrong.
Speaking of open problems, one of the ones you touched upon very briefly in your talk was Goldbach's conjecture, and so I guess one thing that I'm curious about is this the way how both the twin prime conjecture and Goldbach's conjecture sort of kind of fell out next to each other out of the polymath collaboration. Was that just accidental, or was there a deeper link between those two?
So in my talk, I was phrasing the twin prime conjecture as a special case about linear functions being simultaneously prime in the same way that the question about p and 2p plus 1 being simultaneously prime. And from the point of view of essentially all the methods that we have available at the moment, none of these questions are any easier or harder than any other. So the question about twin primes is essentially as difficult or as easy as the question about p and 2p plus 1. And Goldbach's conjecture you can think of in the same light about it being the functions n, little n and 2 times x minus n, where 2 times x is the number that you want to write as the sum of 2 primes. You have to be a little bit careful about there being negative signs there. But essentially, from the point of view of all our current techniques, Goldbach's conjecture and the twin prime conjecture and this question to do with Sophie-Germain primes are all about 2 linear functions being simultaneously prime, and so all have comparable difficulty. So I would have thought that it's quite plausible that if one of you in the audience proves the twin prime conjecture when you're going home on the train tonight, your methods might also prove the Goldbach's conjecture, at least for sufficiently large even numbers. And so you get a 2-for-1 deal.
Two-part question here for Cliff, and feel free to say no comment to the first one if you can't answer it. But when you started your career, how was British intelligence services sharing keys with operatives in hostile states? And more generally, working at GCHQ, kind of what was the culture like? How did they go about fostering innovation?
Fine, I will answer the second question. It was a very collaborative way of working. Basically because you didn't own what you produced. It belonged to the government. And so you were encouraged, if you were doing research, to share it at a very early stage. Even if you had a bad idea, one that didn't quite work, you'd tell people and you'd try to get collaboration. And it's interesting, it's one thing when we started bringing in sort of academics to help work with us, that we kind of had to encourage them because the modus operandi was very much, I'm not going to reveal an idea until I've got it almost there because it's publishing, which is what gets you the credit. Whereas that wasn't the culture in GCHQ. It was very collaborative, which was very positive. Yeah.
Yeah, I think we have one more question actually relating to a possible quantum future. One person here asks, will quantum key distribution ever have commercial relevance, or is it just a meme?
I see. Actual using, it's been shown to work. In that you actually can communicate over long distances using quantum key distribution. It is, however, very expensive, and you have to worry about what's happening at the ends as well. So it's not. You'd have to really not believe in any of the cheaper methods to really want to go for quantum key distribution. And it's also an area that hasn't had perhaps as much scrutiny in terms of what might be ways in to attack it. So I can imagine there being niche applications for it, but I can't see, given its cost and given what you actually get for it, that it's going to become a mainstream way of distributing keys.
And, thank you. And actually, a very related question on homomorphic encryption. I mean, you touched upon that a little bit in your talk, and you mentioned how it is currently extremely slow. Do you think homomorphic encryption will ever become viable for real-world applications?
Fully homomorphic encryption, would it be really nice if it could become viable? And I dare say there will, even at present, there are niche applications, but it is so much more expensive to work with fully homomorphic encryption that it's nowhere near being something that can be generally used. I mean, if it costs no more than ordinary encryption, then it would be massive. I mean, how do you know whether someone's going to come up with some great new idea that's going to do it? But we are a long way off it being ready for prime time, shall I say?
Can we, just when we finish, can we hear just quickly from you, James, about the moment you heard that you'd won the Fields Medal? Because I heard there's a funny story behind that.
Right, so I guess I was actually redecorating my house, and I was painting up a ladder, and I came down the ladder just to sort of check what time it was, half covered in paint, and I got so the first time I got an inkling was when I got this email from the head of the International Mathematical Union saying, oh, is it okay if we have a Zoom chat at some point? So that was the first time I had an inkling. I was obviously trying to tell myself that this wasn't in any way connected to the Fields Medal, and they just wanted me to be on some boring committee, but at least I had a suspicion then that there's not many other reasons why the head of the IMU would contact you. So then I had this Zoom meeting, and I guess there was this famous case of Perelman who declined the Fields Medal, that he didn't want to accept it. And so one of the things that they ask everyone when they say that the committee has decided that they want to award you the Fields Medal is, do you accept the Fields Medal? But at this time, like, my mind was racing, I was super excited, and I just became completely paranoid that I was going to just blurt out, no, I reject the Fields Medal, even though I didn't mean to at all. So I think I just must have looked like the weirdest person in the world, because I sort of was holding my desk and sort of said exceptionally slowly, yes, I accept the Fields Medal. And it's this surreal sort of out-of-body experience saying, yes, I accept the Fields Medal. I've decided after careful consideration not to turn it down.
And just to finish, I think the almost most upvoted question, do you have a favorite prime number, either of you? And what is it?
So somehow the most distinguished prime number in my mind is definitely 2. That somehow always sticks out as being different and interesting, but I can't decide if it's my favorite prime number or my most hated prime number, because often things are much more complicated for mathematicians with 2. So maybe 2 will be my most hated prime number, and 3 will be my favorite prime number.
Okay.